November 1993. Somewhere in the West Midlands, a police officer radios in that he's found the getaway car his force has been chasing for weeks. Then he watches it disappear down the motorway, and he has to admit something almost nobody in British policing had ever admitted before. His patrol car cannot catch this one. Not because his car is broken, because the car in front of him is faster than anything the police own. By the time this chase is over, the gang inside it will have raided shops across the region for months, and nobody, not the local force, not the press, not even Parliament, will ever manage to catch them. That car wasn't a smuggled Ferrari or some underworld import. It was a Vauxhall, a brand people bought to drive to the office, take the kids to school, do the weekly shop. This is the story of how that ordinary-looking Vauxhall, the Lotus Carlton, became so fast that Parliament argued about banning it, and so dangerous in the wrong hands that it turned into the getaway car British police simply could not catch. In 1990, you could walk into any Vauxhall dealership in Britain and order a Cavalier, a Senator, or a Carlton, pick your trim, your engine, your options. Nothing about that lineup should have ended up in a House of Commons debate. But one version of the Carlton did exactly that, because it wasn't really a Vauxhall anymore. It was a Vauxhall that Lotus had quietly turned into the fastest four-door car on Earth. To understand how an unglamorous family sedan ended up there, you have to start with a problem General Motors had in the late 1980s. GM's European arm, Vauxhall in Britain and Opel on the continent, built cars that were efficient and well-engineered, but nobody would call them exciting. They sold well precisely because they were sensible. A company car for a sales rep, a family estate for a commuter, nothing that made a driver's pulse rise. Meanwhile, BMW and Mercedes were making real money selling saloons that doubled as sports cars. The M5, the 500e, cars that let a businessman drive to a boardroom meeting in something that could also embarrass a Porsche off a green light. GM wanted a halo car that could beat the Germans at their own game, something to sit at the very top of the range and drag a little of that prestige down onto the ordinary models beneath it. And GM had just the tool for the job, sitting in its own back pocket. Lotus, the small British engineering house famous for featherweight sports cars and Formula One know-how, which GM had bought into back in 1986. Handing Lotus this project wasn't just about bragging rights either. Lotus was small, chronically undercapitalized, and expensive to keep running. Putting its engineers to work turning a mainstream Vauxhall into a supercar beater was a way to justify that acquisition and put some of GM's own parts bins to profitable use at the same time. The starting point was the standard Carlton, a solid, aerodynamic saloon that had actually won European Car of the Year back in 1987 for its slippery shape and refined engineering. It was sensible, it was comfortable, it was not, by any stretch, a supercar. So Lotus tore into the existing six-cylinder engine and rebuilt it from the inside out, boring and stroking it from 3.0 to 3.6 liters, forging new lightweight pistons that could survive far higher cylinder pressures, and fitting twin Garrett turbochargers where the standard car had none at all. The result was 377 horsepower, more than double the standard Carlton's output, enough on its own to embarrass GM's own American flagship, the Corvette, a car built specifically to be fast. But horsepower on paper is worthless if the rest of the car can't handle it, and here is where the project stopped being a tuning job and became something closer to a ground-up re-engineering exercise. Lotus's engineers went shopping across the entire GM empire for parts strong enough to survive what they'd just built. A 6-speed manual gearbox borrowed from the Corvette ZR1, because nothing in Vauxhall's own catalogue could take that kind of torque. A limited slip differential borrowed from an Australian Holden, another GM subsidiary on the far side of the planet. Brand new brakes, the largest ever fitted to a production saloon at the time, engineered essentially from scratch by Lotus in Norfolk. Even the tyres didn't exist yet. Goodyear had to develop an entirely new compound and construction, the Eagle ZR, tough enough to survive sustained running at 180 miles an hour on a car carrying 4 adults and a boot full of luggage. The suspension was reworked almost entirely, Wider tracks, front and rear, a self-leveling rear end, bigger anti-roll bars, all needed just to keep the car pointed in a straight line at speeds no Vauxhall had ever been asked to reach. In short, engineers had to mash parts sourced from 3 different continents together just to stop this car tearing itself apart at top speed, and every one of those parts had to be validated, tested, and signed off before Vauxhall would let the car near a customer. Lotus painted every single one in one color only, a near-black pearlescent green, mixed specifically for this project, and called Imperial Green, and left the outside almost untouched, a small boot spoiler, a couple of discreet bonnet vents to help the intercoolers breathe, subtle wheel arch flares to cover the wider rubber, and small badges tucked low on the front wings that most people walking past would never even notice. From the outside, it still looked like a company car, the kind of Vauxhall a regional manager might have been given as a perk. That restraint wasn't an accident, and it is exactly what made what came next possible. The numbers, when Vauxhall finally revealed them in late 1990, read like a typo for a family saloon. A top speed of 176 miles an hour, with some independent tests recording it comfortably past 180, 0 to 60 in around 5 seconds, quicker in a straight line than a Ferrari Testarossa, one of the most celebrated supercars of the era. Officially, it was the fastest 4-door production car in the world, faster than the BMW M5 and the Mercedes 500e, both of which their own manufacturers had deliberately capped at 155 miles per hour, not because they couldn't go faster, but because neither BMW nor Mercedes was comfortable putting an unrestricted 180 miles per hour saloon into the hands of ordinary buyers. Vauxhall and Lotus made no such promise, and no such compromise. The price reflected the exotic engineering underneath the plain sheet metal, around £48,000, an enormous sum for a car wearing a Vauxhall badge in 1990, more than 3 times what a well-specced ordinary Carlton would have cost. Only 950 were ever built in total, 320 as right-hand drive Carltons for the British market, and 630 as left-hand drive Opel Omegas for buyers across continental Europe. Demand at that price, for that badge, was thin enough that dealers reportedly still had unsold, unregistered examples gathering dust in showrooms years after production ended. Official Britain hated the car almost from the moment it was announced. The Association of Chief Police Officers formally called for it to be banned outright, or at the very least restricted, warning bluntly and publicly that no patrol vehicle then in service anywhere in the country could keep pace with it if it were ever used to flee the police. A hostile review in Autocar magazine, questioning whether any road car needed to travel at nearly 3 times the national motorway speed limit, gave the Daily Mail exactly the opening it wanted, and the paper ran a sustained campaign demanding the car be pulled from sale entirely. The debate escalated all the way to the floor of the House of Commons on the 16th of November 1990, where members of Parliament argued that a car capable of 170 miles an hour had no business being sold to members of the public at all, that driving it safely required something closer to professional racing skill than an ordinary driving license, and that it should never have reached a showroom in the first place. Curiously, nobody in Parliament raised quite the same objection about the far faster Ferraris and Lamborghinis already legally on sale on British roads that same year, which left more than a few observers wondering aloud if the real discomfort wasn't the top speed at all, but the fact that an ordinary family brand, sold from an ordinary high street dealership, had reached supercar territory at a price a determined professional could actually save up for. Parliament's warning turned out to be exactly right, just not remotely in the way anyone in Westminster had imagined. In November 1993, a Lotus Carlton registered 40RA was stolen from a house in the West Midlands. Over the following months, a gang used it to ram raid shops in the middle of the night, smashing storefronts with the car itself, and stealing tens of thousands of pounds worth of cigarettes and alcohol in each raid, before simply driving away, long before local officers could even get a patrol car onto the road behind them. Ordinary patrol cars of that era struggled to reach 90 miles an hour flat out. The stolen Carlton could nearly double that with room to spare. One officer told the press his force hadn't been able to get anywhere near the thing, and it looked unlikely they ever would. A quote that ran in newspapers across the country and turned what had started as a string of provincial shop break-ins into a national story about how helpless British policing had suddenly become against one stolen family saloon. The gang was methodical about it too. They hid the car by day in ordinary residential streets and garages and raided only at night, vanishing back into normal morning traffic each time in a car that, to any passing officer, looked like 1,000 other Vauxhalls on the road. Neither the car nor the gang responsible was ever caught, and an unconfirmed piece of local legend even claims it once outran a police helicopter on the motorway, a story nobody has ever been able to prove, but one that only cemented what the car had already become in the public imagination. Living proof, captured on television news and splashed across newsprint, that an ordinary-looking family saloon could make an entire regional police force look helpless. That single case became the one everyone remembered, but it wasn't an isolated incident. Because the Carlton looked so unremarkable from the outside, it was quietly becoming the ideal stolen car for a certain kind of criminal. Fast enough to outrun anything the police had on the road. Boring enough in appearance not to draw a second glance on the way there. Insurers noticed the pattern developing, and premiums on the model climbed sharply as a result, pricing out some of the very buyers Vauxhall had originally built the car for. Vauxhall itself quietly pulled the headline top-speed figure from its own advertising material, hoping the whole uncomfortable story would simply fade from public memory. It didn't. By then, the reputation had already set hard, and no amount of marketing could undo what a few newspaper front pages and one long, humiliating chase had already written into the car's legend. So follow the strange loop this car traced from beginning to end. It began as a corporate answer to a marketing problem. General Motors wanting a saloon that could outperform the Germans on paper and drag some prestige down onto an unglamorous badge. By every normal logic, that should have made it a footnote, a low-volume flagship remembered only by enthusiasts flicking through old car magazines. Instead, the very same performance that got it argued over on the floor of Parliament is exactly what turned it into a household name for an entirely different reason. As the car that let a group of ordinary criminals humiliate an entire police force on the front page, night after night, for months on end. The anonymity that Lotus built into its styling, that deliberate restraint of a small spoiler and a subtle badge, wasn't just a design choice made to keep costs down. It's the reason nobody saw it coming when it was stolen, and very possibly the reason the gang inside it got away. Genuine survivors are rare and valuable today, chased by collectors precisely because so few were built in the first place, and because the story attached to them has only gotten stranger and more compelling with the passing decades. There's a simple set of details collectors check to confirm a real one rather than a modified imitation. That one unmistakable imperial green paint, a pearlescent shade, mixed specifically for this car, and offered on no other Vauxhall or Opel before or since. The wider flared arches needed to cover its unusually large wheels, twin bonnet vents feeding the intercoolers beneath, small Lotus badges tucked low behind the front wings, and 17-inch Ronal alloy wheels that no standard Carlton buyer ever had the option to order. In 1990, General Motors wanted a saloon fast enough to beat a Ferrari on paper. Lotus built one so fast that Parliament argued about banning it outright, and criminals turned it into a legend all on their own, with no help from Vauxhall's marketing department at all. Fewer than 1,000 were ever built, and for 2 years, the fastest four-door car in the world hid in plain sight on ordinary British driveways, looking, to anyone who didn't know better, like nothing more than a slightly plain company car parked outside a semi-detached house. It took one stolen example, one gang the police could never quite touch, to prove exactly how much car had been hiding under that quiet green paint all along.